There is a church in a small town along a river in Pennsylvania. And inside that church, there is a staircase that leads up to a choir loft, underneath a stained glass window. For 63 years, that staircase held a secret that only one man on this entire planet knew the answer to. A father walked up those very steps looking for his 9-year-old daughter, who was supposed to be home for dinner. What he found at the top of that staircase would haunt him, his wife, and his surviving daughter for the rest of their lives. And the man responsible would walk free, board a bus, and vanish 1,000 miles away, living for 4 more decades, hurting other children, before he died in a prison cell without ever once being convicted of the crime that started it all. It would take 63 years. It would take a lost letter, sitting untouched in a filing cabinet for over a decade. It would take a stepson, finally telling the truth. And it would take one detective who refused to let a 9-year-old girl become just another name in a cold case drawer. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Type in the comments right now, where are you watching this from, and what time is it for you, right this second, as you're hearing this story for the first time. I read every single one, and I want to know who's out there with me tonight, because this next hour is going to stay with you. Now, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive before we go one step further, because if you don't, you may miss the moment, later in this very story, when we finally say his name out loud. Hit that bell too, so you know the second we drop the next case. Alright. Let's go back, all the way back, to 1962. Her name was Carol Ann Dougherty. She was 9 years old, a 5th grade student at the parish school attached to St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, in a working-class borough called Bristol, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles northeast of Philadelphia, tucked along the banks of the Delaware River. Her parents were Frank and Dorothy Dougherty. She had a little sister, Kay, who was not yet 3 years old at the time, a toddler, too young to understand what was about to happen to her family, but old enough, somehow, to remember the sound of it. Carol Ann was, by every account, a bright and curious child. She loved to read, mystery novels, specifically, the kind of story a clever 5th grader could tear through in a single afternoon and be desperate for the next one by nightfall. She was a regular face at the Bristol Borough Free Library. She would check out her stack of books, read every page at home, and bring them straight back for more, like clockwork, week after week. But there was something else about Carol Ann that everyone who knew her would later describe, almost word for word, in the exact same way. Whenever she passed St. Mark's Church, whether she was on her way to the library, to the corner store, or to a friend's house, she would step inside, just for a moment, and say a quiet prayer. It didn't matter what else she had planned for the day. The church was simply part of her route through the world, the same way the library was. One was where she borrowed stories to take home. The other was where she spoke, quietly, to God. On the afternoon of October the 22nd, 1962, Carol Ann climbed onto her bicycle and rode away from her house. She was planning to meet 2 of her friends at the library to return her books and pick up new ones. Along the way, she stopped at a small corner store on Farragut Avenue for a soda and some penny candy, the ordinary little detour of an ordinary 9-year-old on an ordinary Monday afternoon. Then she got back on her bicycle and rode down Lincoln Avenue, heading toward the church, just like she always did. She never made it to the library. By 4:30 that afternoon, Carol Ann had not come home. At first, her parents weren't panicked. Children lose track of time, children get distracted, children linger with friends. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hours stretched further, worry turned into fear. Frank and Dorothy began searching everywhere they could think of. They checked the library. They checked the homes of her friends. They drove, slowly, along the exact route their daughter would have taken on her bicycle that day, scanning every yard, every sidewalk, every alley. And then, around 6 o'clock that evening, Dorothy saw it. Carol Ann's bicycle, parked outside the doors of St. Mark's Church. She told her husband to go inside and look. Frank Dougherty walked through those church doors that evening, expecting, perhaps, to find his daughter kneeling in a pew, lost in one of her quiet prayers, the way she always was. Instead, he found her on the landing that led up toward the choir loft, beneath a stained-glass window, where the light would have been dim and fading by that hour. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. His little sister, Kay, not even 3 years old that night, would carry one memory from that evening for the rest of her life. It wasn't a memory of her sister. It was the sound her father made when he walked back out of that church and told her mother, in a voice she would later describe as almost inhuman, not to go inside. That sound became the very first clear memory of her father that Kay Dougherty ever had. Whoever had done this left something behind. In the desperate final moments of the struggle, Carol Ann had reached out and torn a few strands of hair from her attacker's body, hair that remained clutched tightly in her small hand when she was found. And scattered near the scene, investigators discovered several cigarette butts, all from the same specific brand. 2 pieces of physical evidence. One suspect they didn't yet know they already had in their file. The murder of a 9-year-old girl, inside a Catholic church, in a tight-knit riverside town where absolutely everybody knew the Dougherty family and absolutely everybody knew St. Mark's, it didn't just shock Bristol Borough. It shattered it. Newspapers ran photographs of Carol Ann's small body being carried down the church steps on a gurney, covered by a white sheet. The horror of that image stayed lodged in the town's collective memory for generations afterward, passed down in hushed conversations from parents who had lived through it to children who hadn't even been born yet. Police went to work immediately. Investigators from local law enforcement and the district attorney's office processed the scene through the entire night. By morning, a full canvass of the neighborhood had begun, officers going door to door, block by block, asking anyone and everyone if they had seen a man near the church that afternoon, someone leaving the area around 3:30, anyone at all who simply didn't belong inside St. Mark's that day. Picture Bristol Borough in 1962. Rowhouses and narrow streets. Front porches close enough that neighbors could hear each other's radios. A town where a 9-year-old girl could ride her bicycle alone across town, in and out of a library, in and out of a church, and no parent would think twice about it, because that was simply how life worked, in a town like that, in an era like that. That sense of safety died on October the 22nd, 1962, and it never fully came back. Parents who had never once worried about their children walking to the corner store began walking them there themselves. Doors that had never been locked started getting locked. An entire generation of Bristol children grew up hearing this story in hushed tones from their own parents, long before they ever understood exactly what it meant. Over the years and decades that followed, in an investigation that would eventually stretch across 3 separate generations of law enforcement, detectives collected hair samples from more than 170 men who had some connection to the case or to the surrounding area. Of those, over 140 samples were actually tested, using the only forensic method available in that era, microscopic hair comparison, examined painstakingly under a lens, strand by strand. And one by one, nearly every single man was eliminated. Except for one. That one sample came back showing what forensic analysts at the time described as significant similarities to the hair recovered from Carol Ann's hand. But here's the problem investigators ran into, and it's a problem that would haunt this case for the next 6 decades. In the early 1960s, microscopic hair comparison could narrow down a group of suspects. It could point a finger. What it could not do, what it was never capable of doing, was deliver the kind of ironclad, courtroom-proof identification that true DNA analysis would eventually make possible, decades later. Investigators had a name in their file that they could not eliminate. They did not have enough to walk into a courtroom and prove it. In the weeks immediately following the murder, detectives zeroed in on at least 4 different men, and the way those 4 leads unfolded would go on to create what investigators, looking back decades later, would describe as nothing short of a perfect storm. The first was an aging local handyman, a man with a documented history of exposing himself to young girls around town. Brought in for hours of intense interrogation, he eventually confessed to the murder. Within 24 hours, he recanted entirely, and investigators determined the confession had been coerced under pressure. He was dismissed as a suspect. The second was a 19-year-old whose own parents were disturbed enough to call the police themselves, after discovering Carol Ann's name written inside his personal notebook. Detectives investigated him thoroughly. He was cleared. The third was a parish priest at St. Mark's itself, a man whose alibi for the exact window of the murder turned out to be a complete fabrication. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered the truth. He had, in fact, been at a store in a nearby borough that afternoon, buying lingerie for a married woman he was secretly pursuing. He would later even be recorded threatening to sexually assault 2 separate women in unrelated incidents. But when it came to the Dougherty murder specifically, he passed a polygraph examination and was eliminated as a suspect. 3 suspects. 3 separate scandals, dead ends, and false leads, each one loaded with just enough smoke to consume weeks and months of investigators' limited time and attention. It was, quite simply, the perfect storm, a flood of plausible-looking suspects that gave the real killer exactly the cover he needed to slip quietly out of the spotlight. Because the 4th man, the one who actually did it, was living the entire time on a street just a block and a half away from the church itself. He first came onto police radar roughly 2 months after the murder, when a neighbor called in a report that he had been acting strangely, and that he had been seen cutting through their yard, near the church, on the very afternoon Carol Ann was killed. Separately, other witnesses in the area described a man with a distinctive scar on his face, seen nearby that same afternoon, a man, as one witness later put it, who looked like he had just done something terrible. In January of 1963, roughly 3 months after the murder, detectives finally brought him in for questioning. He told them, without hesitation, that he had been at work the entire day of the murder. But when investigators pulled his time cards from the tool factory where he was employed, the record told a very different story. He had not worked for 3 consecutive days, and October the 22nd, the day Carol Ann was killed, was one of them. He had lied, directly, to the detectives investigating a child's murder. Investigators collected a hair sample from him. They put him on a polygraph machine. He failed it. And within just a few weeks of that interview, he was gone. He left Bristol entirely, first heading to Florida, then drifting through Texas, before finally settling in a small town in Louisiana, nearly 1,000 miles away from that choir loft where Carol Ann had died. His name went into the case file. And there, for the better part of the next 3 decades, it would largely sit, a name among many, a lead that had gone cold along with everything else. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see exactly who's truly following this story all the way through, because what you're about to hear next is the part of this case that almost nobody outside of Bucks County ever learned about, until very recently. For nearly 30 years, Carol Ann Dougherty's murder sat unsolved. Her parents aged. Her little sister grew from a toddler into a young woman, carrying a grief she'd never fully understood the shape of, in a household that rarely spoke about what had happened. The town of Bristol moved forward, the way towns do, even as the wound never fully closed. Then, in the autumn of 1992, a local newspaper reporter began digging back through the old Dougherty case file, working on a 30th anniversary retrospective piece. What he wrote, a detailed, multi-part investigation into the murder, pulled Carol Ann's story back into the public eye for the first time in a generation. It didn't just move readers. It moved investigators. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office at the time read it. So did the Pennsylvania State Police. And they made a decision, run the hair comparison again, using everything they had, one more time. The result held. The exact same man identified back in January of 1963 remained the only sample, out of everyone ever tested, that investigators simply could not rule out. In 1994, more than 3 decades after the murder, Bucks County formally extradited him from Louisiana, where he was, by that point, already serving time behind bars for an entirely separate crime. A grand jury was convened. 2 men were called to testify before it, the priest who had lied about his alibi all those years earlier, and the man with the scar who had lied about his time cards. The priest testified. Carol Ann's father, Frank Dougherty, testified. But the man who had fled to Louisiana chose to invoke his right against self-incrimination and refused to answer a single question. Both men were given polygraph examinations. Both passed. And in the end, neither one was indicted. He was sent back to Louisiana to finish out his prison sentence there. He had been extradited across state lines. He had sat, silently, before a grand jury convened specifically to determine whether he had murdered a child inside a church. And he had walked away, once again, a free man. Frank and Dorothy Dougherty would carry the weight of that unanswered question for the rest of their lives. Frank had been the one who found her. He had walked into that church that evening looking for a little girl who was simply late for dinner. What he carried back out with him, he never once put down, not for the following 3 decades, not until the day he died. Both of Carol Ann's parents would pass away long before the case was finally solved. Their younger daughter, Kay, the toddler who had once been too young to even understand what had happened, would grow up to become the only remaining member of her immediate family alive to hear her sister's killer finally, formally, named. 5 years after that man died behind bars in a Louisiana state prison, something extraordinary happened, nearly 2,000 miles away from Bristol, Pennsylvania. His stepson walked into a Louisiana parole office and asked to speak with whichever officer was on duty that day. He had something he needed to say. He told the officer that his stepfather had confessed to him, before his death, to committing a murder in Pennsylvania decades earlier. A little girl, killed inside a church, a crime the old man himself had reportedly once called, chillingly, the perfect murder. For more than 40 years, not a single investigator had ever connected this man directly to that confession. The officer took the account seriously. He wrote it all down, carefully, and mailed the letter to authorities in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And then, for reasons that have never been fully explained, that letter simply went into a file. A detective received it and did nothing further with it. And when that detective eventually retired from the force, the letter went with the rest of his old paperwork, into storage. A confession. From the only suspect whose hair evidence could never be excluded. Written down, carefully, by a Louisiana parole officer, and mailed directly to the very agency that had failed to indict that same man back in 1994. It sat there, forgotten, in a desk drawer in Bucks County, for over a decade. By the time anyone in law enforcement would read that letter again, the man who had made the original confession to his stepson had already been dead for nearly 20 years. While that letter sat buried in a filing cabinet, the man responsible for Carol Ann's murder had already gone on to hurt someone else, a fact that, in hindsight, makes the lost decade even harder to sit with. On Halloween night in 1970, 8 years after he killed Carol Ann Dougherty, he got into a heated argument with his wife at their home in Louisiana. During that argument, he reportedly told her that if she was still inside the house when he returned, he would set it on fire. Roughly 2 hours before the fire actually started, he purchased a small amount of gasoline. Later that same night, the house burned. Inside was a 12-year-old girl named Catherine Marie Smith, who was staying over for Halloween as a guest of his stepdaughter. Catherine died in that fire. His own stepdaughter survived, but was left with permanent brain damage. His wife was hospitalized, but survived as well. At the time, in 1970, fire investigators could not determine the cause of the blaze. The case went cold and sat, untouched, for 15 years. Then, in 1985, the state of Louisiana reopened the original investigation, re-examined the preserved fire scene using updated methods, and arrested him on a charge of first-degree murder. A grand jury indicted him. What ultimately moved the case forward, after 15 years of silence, was a single witness, a woman who had been just 13 years old on the night of that Halloween fire, and who had overheard him make that exact threat to burn the house down. She had never told anyone outside her own family. Nobody had ever thought to ask her, not until investigators finally went back, 15 years later, and started talking to everyone who had been in the room that night. A jury ultimately returned a manslaughter verdict against him in June of 1986. He was sentenced to the maximum penalty available for that lesser charge, and sent to serve his time at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. His brief trip back to Pennsylvania in 1994, to sit silently before that grand jury, was little more than an interruption in a much longer prison sentence he was already serving in another state entirely. He was still incarcerated on the morning he died of a heart attack, in July of 2002. Over the course of his life, he had caused the deaths of 2 children, in 2 different states, and he never once stood trial as a murderer for either one of them. In the early 2020s, a Bucks County detective lieutenant made a In the early 2020s, a Bucks County detective lieutenant made a decisive. In the early 2020s, a Bucks County detective lieutenant made a decision that would ultimately crack this case wide open. He went back to page 1. Every single police report. Every interview transcript. Every scrap of paper, every note, every lead, going all the way back to the very first witness statements taken on the night of October the 22nd, 1962, all the way through to the very last entry in the file. 6 decades worth of investigative work, read again from the beginning. He worked closely with troopers from the Pennsylvania State Police's Criminal Investigations Unit, a small, dedicated team assigned to dig back through one of the oldest unsolved child murders in the county's history. And buried inside the retired records of a now long-departed detective, he found it. The letter. The one written by a Louisiana parole officer, more than 15 years earlier, containing a dead man's confession, sitting exactly where it had been filed away and forgotten. He pulled it. He added it to the active case file, where it should have been from the very beginning. The team also made the decision to send the original, decades-old hair samples to a modern forensic laboratory in Texas, one that specializes in extracting usable DNA profiles from severely degraded forensic evidence. It was, by their own admission before the results even came back, a genuine long shot. Those samples had spent 60 years being moved between evidence storage locations, including, for a period, an unheated attic inside a municipal building, exposed to the full swing of brutal Pennsylvania winters year after year. The lab did everything it could. In the end, it could not extract a usable genetic profile. The one piece of physical evidence that had pointed, consistently, at a single man for 6 decades, the very thing that could have delivered absolute, scientific certainty, was simply too degraded to finish the job. So investigators did the only thing left to do. They went to Louisiana anyway. In November of 2024, the Bucks County detective and troopers from the Pennsylvania State Police sat down, face to face, with the stepson, the very same man who had walked into that parole office nearly 2 decades earlier and tried to tell someone the truth. This time, someone was finally listening. He told investigators that his stepfather had confessed to him, not once, but on 2 separate occasions, years apart, that he had lured a little girl inside a church in Pennsylvania, sexually assaulted her, and ultimately killed her specifically to keep her from ever telling anyone what had happened. What made his account so powerful, according to investigators, wasn't simply what he said. It was what he clearly did not already know. He had no prior knowledge of specific details from the case file, details like precisely where inside the church the murder had taken place, or where the victim's bicycle had been found parked outside. Details, investigators concluded, that could only have come from someone who had actually confessed to being there, in person, on that exact day. His name was William Schrader. Originally from another part of Pennsylvania, Schrader had come to live in Bristol Borough, settling on a street just a block and a half from St. Mark's Church, in the very months before Carol Ann Dougherty was murdered. Investigators would later describe him, in blunt terms, as a documented, lifelong predator, a man whose pattern of targeting children stretched from that church in 1962 all the way through the rest of his life. On October 29, 2025, 63 years and 1 day after Carol Ann Dougherty's body was found, the Bucks County District Attorney stood in front of a room full of cameras and reporters and announced what a formal investigating grand jury had concluded. After months of renewed effort, William Schrader had raped and murdered Carol Ann Dougherty, inside St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, on October 22, 1962. The grand jury's findings, laid out across a report running 53 pages long, wove together every single thread investigators had spent more than 6 decades pulling at, the hair evidence that could never fully exclude him, the witness who eventually placed him near the church that afternoon, his own documented lies about where he had actually been that day, his sudden flight from the state within just weeks of the murder, and, finally, the confession he made, twice, to his own stepson. Decades later and 1,000 miles away. Schrader was never tried in an actual courtroom for Carol Ann's murder. He had already died in prison, back in 2002, having been convicted years earlier of manslaughter in the death of that 12-year-old girl, killed in the Halloween house fire he set 8 years after murdering Carol Ann. Investigators also revealed that after fleeing Pennsylvania, Schrader went on to abuse other children within his own family for years afterward. Because he was already deceased, the grand jury's formal finding brought the case to an official close, without a criminal trial. But for a family that had waited 63 years, it delivered the one thing that had always been missing. A name. Kay Dougherty, Carol Ann's little sister, the toddler who had once heard her father's voice break outside that church, and the only surviving member of her immediate family, stood before reporters on the day the case was finally announced as solved. For decades, she had lived not knowing whether an answer would ever come at all, carrying a grief that belonged to a sister she never really had the chance to know. Think about that for a moment. An entire childhood, an entire adult life, shaped around a question that refused to close. Every birthday that never happened. Every milestone her sister never got to reach. 19 years old, in 1972. 29, in 1982. 39, in 1992. By the time a grand jury finally spoke her killer's name out loud, Carol Ann Dougherty would have been 72 years old, a grandmother, perhaps, somewhere in a version of this story that never got to happen. The answer had been a block and a half away the entire time, and for 63 years, no one could prove it. For 63 years, her family lived without a single answer. A predator built an entirely new life 1,000 miles away, and went on to hurt other children, while the one piece of paper that could have stopped him decades sooner sat, unread, in a drawer. It took a newspaper reporter who simply refused to let the story die. It took a Louisiana parole officer who wrote down exactly what he was told. It took a detective, decades later, willing to start over completely from page 1. And, in the end, it took a stepson finally willing to say, out loud, what he had been carrying quietly for years. That is how they finally closed the file on the girl in the choir loft. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do 3 things for me right now, before you go anywhere else. Hit that subscribe button, so you never miss a case the moment we release it. Drop a like on this video, so more people finally get to hear Carol Ann's story. And down in the comments, tell us which unsolved case you want the Cold Case Archive to dig into next. We'll see you in the next file.